1, 2. Can everyone hear me okay? Good to go? Okay. Colossians 3:12 through 15. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience.
Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive.
And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony.
And let the peace of Christ rule in your heart, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful.
Thank you, Lily. So that was Colossians 3:12 through 15. And that's going to be the main verse that we're going to be exploring today. So we are in the middle of a sermon series for the new year that's called Resetting. So at the beginning of the year, Pastor Larry and Sarah and I were talking about taking some time to look at these different areas that are of our lives that may need the reset button hit. The new year is a great time to reassess where we are at in our lives. So we've talked about a lot of great topics. Last week, Pastor Larry talked about resetting our finances and did such a good job tackling that difficult topic. And today we're going to continue on and we're going to reset our values. And so whenever I read this passage that we just went through, it talks a lot about forgiveness. It talks a lot about virtues and values, but forgiveness is something that is connected to the heart of this passage for the Apostle Paul. And so when I read this a couple weeks ago in preparation for this message, it reminded me of when I'm at work working with kids and students. And it reminded me of whenever there's something happening on the basketball court or the dodgeball court or playing a game of kickball, and you see something happen between two students, whether it's an accident or on purpose. When someone gets into an argument or someone accidentally gets hit in the head by a ball or something, it reminds me a lot of that instinctively when I read this. And whenever that happens, and I'm at the community center, and something happens between two students, the student always comes over and is like, Mr. Chris, I'm so sorry that this happened, because they can usually tell that they're probably going to be in trouble for whatever reason. And they always come over and they say, Mr. Chris, I am so sorry. And there's this part of me that's like, oh, I'm so glad they came over and they apologized. But then there's always this part of me that's a little bit sad. And it's sad because they're apologizing to me and not the person that was harmed. So when they apologize to me, it's to avoid some sort of punishment. Maybe they'd have to sit out a round of the game. Maybe we'd have to call their parent, depending on the severity of it, or some other punishment. And their apology to me only takes them so far. It might get them out of a little bit of punishment or something like that. It only takes them so far because apologizing to me in that situation does not reconcile the issue with the student that they caused harm to. I'll say that one more time. When they apologize to me, it does not reconcile the issue with the student that they caused harm to. So my question for you today is, how often do you think God feels the same way with us? How often do we go to God for forgiveness when we harm someone? Maybe it's not a game of dodgeball. Maybe it's something at work. Maybe it's with a lifelong friend. Maybe it's in a marriage. Maybe it's with a sibling. But how often do we run to God and ask for forgiveness and think things are all fine and good and dandy? And God almost sits there with this excitement, but a little bit of sadness as the result, because the relationship hasn't actually been reconciled. I'm sure lots of parents and grandparents here hear that story and can really resonate with it and say, yeah, there's been times that my own child or grandchild or niece or nephew has come to me in a similar situation. So when I read what the Apostle Paul is telling us in Colossians, that's what comes to mind. How often does God just wish and long that the forgiveness would not just be vertical, but also horizontal? The forgiveness that God requires is far more difficult than we sometimes allow to slide in everyday life. In fact, the Jewish law seemingly had something in place for an issue like this. If you did something wrong, you didn't just make a sacrifice to God. You didn't just make a sacrifice to God asking for forgiveness, but you had to pursue the wronged party for forgiveness. And it seems like the consensus was that if you did not seek out reconciliation between the person that you wronged, it's almost as if your sacrifice was in vain. I'll say that again. If you didn't actually seek out reconciliation horizontally with the people around you and merely kept it vertical, it was almost as if the vertical was in vain, according to Jewish law. So when we look to reset our lives in alignment with the vision that God has for forgiveness, it's a difficult thing because it requires a lot of work on our part. And we don't always like that. It would be far easier if we could just say the right words to God in our bedroom at night. But that's not quite the forgiveness that Paul is talking about here. He has that Jewish idea in his mind that in the Christian community, it was supposed to follow in that same trajectory and include forgiveness to your peers, to your friends, and to your family. Forgiveness is tough. And that's just one of the few things that Paul is discussing here in Colossians. He also gives us a long list of virtues and values that we should reset for ourselves. The church in Colossae should reset for themselves. And the first virtue is compassionate hearts. And I'm going to do this with kindness as well. But Paul mentions compassionate hearts. And there's this idea in the Greek language with compassion, where it comes from the same word that like your organs and intestines comes from. And the reason was, they said that when you had compassion, you felt this pain inside of you that they didn't quite know where to attribute it to. So it would be like if instead of the word compassion, whenever you felt that feeling, it would be like if we replaced that word with intestines. Because it was this feeling that you felt inside of you, that you just had to do something to make it right. And so that's the value that Paul is talking about to the church in Colossae. This requires empathy. And empathy's hard. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes is never an easy thing to do. I'll give an example. Have you ever been frustrated at a restaurant or maybe on the phone when you couldn't recognize what someone was saying because of an accent? I'm sure we've all been there before. And I've heard this kind of harmful phrase, just speak English. Or maybe even ironically, just speak American. It's not a very helpful phrase, and it does lack empathy. When Sarah and I were 20 or 21 years old, the university that we were attending, for a part of our degree, they dropped us off into another country in Central America to attend language school. Yeah, just dropped us off. And And they said, while you're here, try not to speak any English to each other. And so that was a part of our program that we were in. So they kind of dropped us off. And so we were there for 4 months where we kind of grunted our way through language school. And it was a daily occurrence that I would somehow butcher the Spanish language or accidentally say something that was terribly offensive. We've all had toddlers in our lives that, whether it's a speech impediment or they're just learning the language, they accidentally say a horrible word instead of the sweet, kind little word that they were saying. I did that as a 21-year-old man on a daily basis in a country where I did not look like everyone else. And I had no idea what was going on or why people laughed hysterically when I would say words. They'd be like, oh no, don't say that. I'm like, oh. And so we're in this country that's foreign to us. And one day, Sarah was homesick, but I went on a long hike up a mountain with some friends. Absolutely beautiful. But this is towards the beginning of our stay there. And at this point, I didn't really know any Spanish. You know, my Spanish was about that big at the time. So we went through this long walk in the scorching heat. I had carried about 3 to 4 liters of water in my backpack with me. And at this point, it was all gone. And so we're in this little town after we go through the mountains, out of water, and we finally find the right bus stop. Again, don't speak the language, don't really know what's going on. Found a bus with the right town labeled on it, so we took it. And while we're sitting on this bus, one of my friends, we've been hiking for 8 hours, he kind of falls asleep in the seat. And his foot goes just outside of the aisle while he's sleeping. And this man walks by who's about our age, maybe a couple years older, and he stumbles over his foot as he walks by. The man did not get hurt. He hardly stumbled. He caught himself very easily. There was no real harm done. But he looked back at us, and in Spanish, starts yelling at us, starts swearing at us, and begins to try to extort us for money that we definitely didn't have, and started using lots of big words that we didn't quite understand. At this point, I knew nothing. I'm saying words like, bread makes me smile. That's the extent of my Spanish at this point. But my friend that's with me knows Spanish a lot better. He's also fluent in French, so it came a lot quicker. And so later he filled me in on everything. He's like, yeah, he's going to sue us for dental damage and all kinds of stuff. And I'm just sitting there just kind of smiling and nodding because he was very upset. And I'm like, should I tell him that bread makes me happy? I don't think that would help this situation. But anyways, began to extort us. And the locals that are on this bus look at us, seeing that we're helpless, and they began booing this man. They began yelling at the man that was trying to extort us, to the point where there was essentially an angry mob on this bus at this man that's trying to do us wrong. And he sees the tension starting to rise, and he starts pulling the bus string. And the bus driver notices it and laughs and doesn't stop the bus. He's letting him get his just desserts in that moment. Eventually, after he learned his lesson, he pulled over and let the man off the bus after he's banging on the door trying to get out. But empathy is hard. I didn't quite learn what empathy was until that day. I didn't quite know what it meant to be in a minority population, powerless, until that day. Until some individuals that we didn't know, that we would never see again, had compassion for us and had kindness for us, and came alongside us to help protect us. People that didn't look like them, people that had very little in common. They had compassion and took care of us. The world of the New Testament was truly a melting pot of cultures and ethnicities and languages. Compassion was a thing that extended far beyond these barriers in the church's instance. much like the story I just told. These individuals felt compassion for me, even though I looked different than them and spoke a different language. A compassionate heart is a value that Paul is calling us to reset in this passage. The next couple that Paul is discussing is humility and meekness. Also, very difficult things for us to try to reset in our lives. We live in a world where everyone wants to be the best at everything. Competition is something that we face every single day, at work, at school, at the gym, and even in the church sometimes. We have a layer of competition. We live in a world that seems to be wired and geared for this competition. And competition isn't really a bad thing, but it has creeped into every aspect of life and kills our contentment. It kills our humility and meekness when we allow competition to take over. Sarah and I were previously church planters. And I learned that if Jesus was a church planter, he would not fit today's metrics of success. Jesus would not necessarily be, he would not be like the role model. He would not be the one selling all of the books for church planting or for church building today. His ministry team had no money or budget. They had no building. They had no housing allowances or parsonages. And they had no marketing plan. Instead, when their ministry finally began to grow, they tried to make Jesus king by force. His humility and meekness would not let that happen because it was not the plan that God had for his life. And unfortunately, most metrics of success, or what it means to be successful in the church, it doesn't quite align with Paul's values and virtues that he's setting for us. Again, if Jesus was leading a ministry today, he would have been seen as a failure in the eyes of many people. He died practically alone on a cross that he didn't deserve. So I'm here to tell you, humility and meekness does not always look like success in the way that we typically see it today. But it does look like faithfulness to God. And that's very difficult for us as we attempt to reset our lives this new year. One of the final things that Paul mentions in this passage is patience. Again, another thing that's difficult and takes a lot of work. I read a book some time ago called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And it was a book that caught my eye because the idea was that patience was the core value of the early church. And I was like, man, that's weird. I'm going to read that and prove it wrong. Because it seemed like a silly or a novel idea. And as I began to read this book, it began to challenge me. So Paul is addressing patience. And there are some things that we know about the early church. And this list is long, so if you'd like any further information about any of these, talk to me afterwards. But here's a few of the things. And again, I don't necessarily think that these are ways that we should do church today necessarily. But the patience here required to implement these is the key. Patience was renewing people from their old habits or values and virtues into the newness of Christ. Habits are difficult. Habits takes time. Habits takes patience. As a part of this, they had a long catechism. Many of you know what that phrase means if you've ever been to a Catholic church. They had a time of instruction for anyone. They called them candidates before they even were allowed to come to a church service. They would make sure that if someone was going to come and follow after Christ, that they were willing to let old habits die so that new habits and ways of being could take root. That takes an awful lot of patience. They were convinced that the candidate's behavior was the most reliable predictor of whether they would learn the Christian habits. They also believed that the lives of Christians and their communities provided evidence of the truth of their words. They believed that actions spoke far louder than any words they could say or things that would happen in their minds. These Christians would daily gather together with other believers, and not just a church or a Bible study. They lived their life together patiently, and they would take time to make sure that they were each living and doing the things that they said they were going to do in accordance with God's plan for their lives. They would also twice weekly gather for communal fasts. That takes some patience. Have you ever given up food before? I turn into a grumpy person very, very quickly if I go like 6 hours without eating. I tell Sarah, I kind of graze throughout the day. I sit down and eat meals, but I just love to like snack on like little meals. They would fast twice a week. But they would fast, but then they would also gather for feasts together. They had horizontal relationships among believers of different economic and social groups. And that's difficult because it makes you have to sit and think for a while. When you surround yourself with people from different languages, different cultures, and different barriers, you have to take extra time for every single thing that is communicated in your group. There may have had to have been translators present. And that takes patience to listen and wait. They were not necessarily focused on the type of evangelism that we often think of. But they believed that if they lived faithful and patient lives, that the fruit of their lives was the far better option for evangelism. That as they lived these patient lives, allowing God's truth to ferment in their lives, that people would notice it. They would notice that the Christians were the ethical business leaders in town. They would notice that the Christians were not taking advantage of their neighbors like others were. So patience was important. They believed that the quality of each believer was very important, more so than the quantity, which takes patience. And that doesn't always fit what we think success looks like today. So when Paul is talking about patience, he's talking about a lifelong journey of letting old habits die and allowing new values and virtues to take root and to take shape and to ferment in your life. And they trusted God for their future, which is one of the most difficult things for us to do in regard to patience today. No one likes to wait. We want things now. Raise your hand if you have an Amazon Prime membership so you can get free 2-day delivery. No? Only like 6 of you? I don't know. I don't believe that. We want things fast. We want things instantly. We want them now. But they believe that they had to patiently wait for God's presence to be evident in their lives. The next passage that deeply connects with this one, Paul is speaking to another church in the form of a letter. And he says, "Join together in following my example, brothers and sisters. And just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do." And when we read that verse or that text today, sometimes it just kind of passes by. But it takes new meaning when we understand the quality of believer that they were trying to build in their churches. They had high standards for their folks, not just to keep people out, but to make sure that they were the people that they said they were going to be. So Paul saw himself as a model of following after Christ. But he also acknowledged that within these congregations, that they were doing such a good job of creating new values and virtues that followed after Christ, that there were other believers that they should look to as models. I believe I've shared this story with you guys before, but for some of our students here, it might be a newer one. I have a student that comes to the community center, and he came through all of our Bible study on the book of Luke. And I would tell all of my students every day at the end of this Bible study, if you ever want to know more about any of this, just come and find me, and I'll walk you home, and we'll talk about it. And I told all of our boys in that group that if you ever had anything you needed to talk about, I'll walk you home and talk about it. And I had a boy one day who lived not that far away, but one of the further students. And he said, "Mr. Chris, will you walk me home today?" And I said, "Absolutely, let me clean the tables, get everything reset, and we'll walk home." And as soon as we start walking to his house, he's just shuffling his feet very slowly. And he was trying to turn a 5-minute walk into a 20-minute walk. And he said, "Mr. Chris, are you aware of the car break-ins that have been happening?" And I said, "Yeah, I know all about those." And he continues to shuffle his feet and keep his head down. He said, "Well, I want you to know that me and my 2 older cousins, who are 17 and 15, we're walking downtown, and as we're walking downtown, they would jiggle the car handles to see if they were unlocked. And they would steal whatever change or money or things they could find in there. And they weren't really finding much. But we came to one car, and they opened it, and the keys were in it. And so they started the car, and they looked at me and said to this 12-year-old student, "Get in the car." And these were his 2 older cousins that he looks up to. 2 older cousins that are a model for him. 2 older cousins that are trying to teach him about values and virtues and habits that he should follow after. And he looked at those 2 older cousins as they rolled down the window, and he said, "I don't mess with that," and he ran home. It takes a lot of guts to tell your role models in life that you're done with them and to run home. And so I asked this student, I said, "So why are you telling me this?" He said, "Well, they got caught in the car, and one of them's in jail and one of them's in juvie or some combination of that." And I looked at him and I said, "I'm so proud of you that you're not sitting there with them. Because if you would have went with them, you'd be right next to them." And he was seeking out me and our other volunteers at the community center to share this story with, because he was wanting us to know that he was not giving in to the models that we had been speaking against in these Bible studies, and that he was willing to try something new. And that was really the heart of evangelism in the early church. It was, how is that life working for you? Why don't you come try these shoes on? That was the heart of evangelism that Paul was talking about here. Paul continues on, and he says, "For as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction. Their God is their stomach. Their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things." It says, "But our citizenship is in heaven." And as you read about the early church, one author suggests that the word faith or faithfulness, like faith in God, doesn't really communicate what it meant for them. And they suggested the word allegiance here. They said your God was the thing that you gave most allegiance to. If your allegiance was to your bank account, there was a God of wealth that you could give your life to. If your allegiance was to having a large family, there was a goddess of fertility. If you simply give into whatever physical desire you had, then you made yourself your God. And that's what Paul is battling against here. When he says their gods is their stomach, they go after whatever thing their body tells them to go after. They go after whatever thing their mind tells them to go after. But what Paul ends with is what our citizenship, our allegiance is in heaven. They had this phrase that said, Jesus is Lord. And they would insert after that oftentimes, not Caesar. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. Jesus is Lord, not our stomach, not wealth, not all of these other things. And that takes patience. Those are the values that Paul is calling us to reset in our lives today. Our citizenship is in heaven. So this is a time to reset our values and our virtues and choose what we're going to give our faith and our allegiance to. Paul told us that the values we should exhibit are compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, and bearing with one another in love and forgiveness. And he says that all of these things are drawn together through the bond of love. None of these things are easy. All of these things take patience. All of these things take time. I'm going to ask William, I'm going to ask Landis, and I'm going to ask Miss Sarah if they would mind coming on up and helping me with something real quick. I didn't tell the boys about this. It's easy. I'm just going to have them pass something out for me. But they're going to pass out something really cool and something really fun. They're going to go around and pass out a little can of Play-Doh. So there should be more than enough for everybody. So we'll take just a minute to get them open and to get a little piece of it out. So as you get your Play-Doh, take just a little piece out. We'll wait just a couple of minutes. You might have a little wrapper to take off of it. Might be a little difficult to get open. It's very difficult when you have a microphone in your hand too. This is the patience that we're learning about. You learn it from a young age, opening cans of Play-Doh. Did everyone get a can?
Yeah.
Almost there. Pastor Lyric said he can help others. They need help.
Here we go. I didn't know Play-Doh came with a child-proof lid.
Yeah, exactly. Adult-proof. So as you get it open, we'll take a couple more steps. It's a workout, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, as you get it open and you start to take a little piece out, I want you to take it and I want you to hold it out in front of you in your hand. We'll wait for everyone. There's still a couple more folks. Take a little piece out, or you can share a little bit if you have yours open and your neighbor doesn't. You can pull a little piece out. So, go ahead and just take just a ugly little lump of it and just set it out in your hand in front of you. And I want you to look at it. And I want you to think in your head, turn into a ball. go ahead, hold it out in front of you in an ugly little lump. And tell it, turn into a round ball. Any luck? Anyone? Did it work? Didn't work for anybody? Okay. Now, I want you to take that same little ugly lump and start to roll it. Roll it a little bit. After you roll it a few times, okay, that's not quite a ball, but like, it's getting there. Keep rolling it. A little better. Maybe reach to the neighbor next to you, ask them for a little bit of help. ask for a little bit of help. And the more that we begin to roll this, the more it begins to take the shape that we want it. How true is that for our lives? Oftentimes we read scripture and we attend church and we do all of these things. We read the Bible and we tell ourselves, I'm going to be this type of person. I'm going to apply this virtue or value to my life. And we take the same exact approach of just looking at the ugly lump and telling it to turn into something. And we very quickly learn that that doesn't really work. It doesn't get the desired results. But it takes patience. It takes some hard work. Sometimes we have to ask the person next to us for some forgiveness or a little bit of assistance along the way. And over time, after a few passes, it's getting closer. It's not quite where we want it to be, but it's progress. After another couple dozen times, it's even better. After another few passes, even better yet. How true is that with our lives? Or we want the quick results of just telling things, just thinking things in our minds. But it takes effort. How true is that for us as we begin to reset our lives in the new year? How true is that for us as we reset our finances in the new year? It takes time. It takes hard work. And it takes patience. And sometimes it takes a little bit of help along the way. So that is our message for today. So I pray that these words from Paul the Apostle will permeate into your lives. But it won't just permeate into your brain, but it'll permeate into your habits and into your formation as a Christian. God, thank you so much for the congregation that is here today to learn about resetting ourselves. And resetting ourselves in a way that aligns with your cross and aligns with love that binds all of these things together. Pray that as we go home, that these will not just be intellectual ideas, but these will be things that we patiently apply to our lives and do the hard work of following after you in a faithful manner. God, we love you and we are so thankful for what you are doing. In your name we pray. Amen. So your challenge is to take this home, either put it on your desk at work, maybe put it in your car on your dashboard or something like that. If you're a student, you may put this in your backpack, you might put it on your desk, you might put it on a little reading area that you have at home. But when you see this, this is a physical and tangible reminder that it takes hard work to reset our lives. So go from this place filled with hope and filled with patience as we begin to reset our lives for the new year. So go in peace.
Yes.